1 year ago, Dune Part 2 released in theaters, and many consider it to be one of the best films of 2024. In a time where film adaptations feel so cash-grabby and soulless, how did Denis Villeneuve create an adaptation that captures the hearts of viewers all over the world? In this video, we're gonna dive deep into Dune Part 2 and see what makes it such a great film. We'll cover the production of the film, looking at Denis Villeneuve and how his philosophy impacted the production. We'll of course dive deep into the film itself and what makes it such a great adaptation and sequel. Then we'll wrap up the video by looking at the reception of the film and how it has aged 1 year later. So let's begin by looking at the production of Dune Part 2 and at the secrets of Denis Villeneuve's philosophy. Frank Herbert's Dune was written all the way back in 1965. That was 60 years ago. Since then, there have been many attempts at adapting the novel, even though many considered the novel unadaptable because of the depth and the richness of the story. The first attempt to adapt the novel happened in the 70s, within a decade of the novel's release. Alejandro Jodorowsky acquired the rights to make a 14-hour adaptation. Regardless of the final product, this would have been really cool to see. But the project failed to secure the funding it needed, and therefore it was never made. The next attempt to adapt Dune took place in 1984 with the classic David Lynch version. This adaptation may have had its fans, but it was not a widely praised film. Lynch wanted the film to be 3 hours, but it was trimmed down to be just over 2 hours. Covering Dune in just over 2 hours is simply not possible. The film failed to develop its characters, and frankly the effects have aged terribly. David Lynch, may he rest in peace, famously disowned the film, not being proud of his work. In 2000, there was a television adaptation of Dune from Richard P. Rubenstein that aired on the Sci-Fi Channel. While this had been the most successful adaptation of Dune to date, it still didn't live up to the potential that was Dune. The miniseries felt handicapped by the limited budget. Others argued the series was too faithful to the source material, making it feel awkward as a television series instead of a book. For a while, that was the last attempt at Dune. But the 2000s saw a big change in the blockbuster era. Franchises began taking shape, with 2 of these franchises being adaptations of books. Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter were widely successful adaptations, both of which changed pop culture forever. With the success of these franchises, there had been hope that Dune could join the ranks as one of the best book-to-movie adaptations of our time. Later on in the decade, in 2008, Peter Berg was hired to direct the next adaptation of Dune. However, only a year later did he end up leaving the project. While the Dune adaptation lay dormant, Hollywood saw the rise of its next best director, Denis Villeneuve. Films like Prisoners and Sicario really brought him onto the scene, and then his subsequent films Arrival and Blade Runner 2049 brought him into the sci-fi world. In 2016, while making Blade Runner, he expressed interest in adapting Dune, considering the novel one of his favorite books ever written. In January 2017, shortly after receiving an Oscar nomination for Best Director, Villeneuve was chosen to direct Dune. Roughly a year later, in March 2018, it was revealed that Villeneuve made a deal with Warner Bros. To split Dune into 2 movies. Right from the get-go, it was understood that Villeneuve had made it his top priority to get this story right. After so many failed adaptations, he was finally going to do Dune justice. He was locked in and focused on making this movie the best and most faithful adaptation possible. And if that meant making it 2 movies, then it would be 2 movies. When it came to the adaptations that preceded Villeneuve, Villeneuve didn't look or take any inspiration from them. He wanted his Dune to be his own vision, not clouded by other failed attempts. After casting, principal photography on Dune Part 1 began in March 2019, with an expected release date of October 2020. I won't spend too much time discussing the production of Part 1 because this is a Part 2 video, but what happened in 2020 cannot be ignored, and that's of course the pandemic. Dune Part 1 was delayed an entire year, but what was more controversial than that was the decision to release Dune in theaters and on streaming. Villeneuve was furious about this decision. For one, there were concerns that a poor box office performance would result in Part 2 never being made. Keep in mind, even though it was agreed that Villeneuve would adapt Dune into 2 movies, Part 2 was not officially greenlit. Warner Warner Brothers wanted to see how Part 1 would do. But maybe more important than that was Villeneuve wanting to protect the theater-going experience. Villeneuve had talked about how important visuals and sound were to him. He's gone on record saying how much he hates dialogue. To him, movies are all about expressing a story through visuals and sounds. A blockbuster movie with the scale of Dune needs to be seen on the big screen. A big part of Dune is its setting. Arrakis is pretty much a character. Watching Dune on a TV screen, or even worse, on a phone, will not do the movie justice. This is why Villeneuve was so adamant that people see Dune in theaters. But he was helpless, however, and Dune Part 1 was released on HBO Max. Now, despite having significant viewership on streaming, Dune Part 1 still managed to gross over $400 million at the box office. While this may seem like a disappointment for a blockbuster of this size, considering its shared viewership with the streaming service, and considering the world was in a pandemic, this was seriously impressive. Dune Part 1 was also a critical success. The film scored an 83% on Rotten Tomatoes, along with a 90% audience score. On IMDb, the film scored an 8 out of 10. In short, people loved Dune. Because of the film's financial and critical success, Dune Part 2 was officially greenlit. But Villeneuve would only return under one condition: that Part 2 be given an exclusive and guaranteed theatrical window. This movie needed to be seen on the big screen, and he wanted to protect that movie-going experience. Warner Brothers gladly accepted, and production on Dune Part 2 was officially underway. When watching the behind-the-scenes material for Dune Part 2, it is clear that Villeneuve had two priorities: making Dune a visual spectacle and honoring Frank Herbert's story as much as possible. When it comes to the visuals and spectacles of Dune, there was so much passion exuded from Villeneuve and the rest of the team. Like his buddy Christopher Nolan, Villeneuve loves IMAX. He went out of his way to shoot Dune Part 2 with the widest IMAX lens possible, putting more visuals on the screen than ever before. Cinematographer Greg Fraser spoke a lot about the spirituality of Dune, how all the locations such as Arrakis and the other planets had such a richness and depth to them that needed to be properly conveyed. The way this was accomplished was through the sets and locations used during filming. The set designers on Dune took heavy inspiration from real-world architecture. The city of Arrakeen was inspired by the Great Pyramids and brutalist architecture. Villeneuve wasn't just concerned with making the city look cool, however, he wanted it to feel real. How would a fortress on a planet like Arrakis actually operate? How would it be built to survive the harsh environments of the desert? Behind the scenes, you can hear a lot about these sloped walls being there to deflect harsh winds of sandstorms. They talk about the lack of windows to keep the heat out of the fortress, while also having small slinted windows to allow some natural light in. They talk about the importance of concrete and how that would make for a strong defense of the castle, because Middle Easterns spent centuries building structures that took into account the extreme heat of the area. All these little details may seem obvious, but you'd be surprised how many science fiction or fantasy movies are more concerned with how cool things look rather than how they would actually operate. When you look at the sets that take place on other planets, you can see that same attention to detail, even though they're not as prominent as Arrakis. Caladan from Part 1 has a very distinct style compared to Arrakis. In Part 2, for the location with Irulan and the Emperor, the crew traveled to Italy to film at the Brionne Cemetery. Going to real locations built by real architects instead of building your own sets is a great way to add more culture to the sets. My favorite new location in Part 2 has to be Getty Prime. I know it was briefly shown in Part 1, but Part 2 added so much life to the planet, or lack thereof. I love how Villeneuve talked about wanting to make Getty Prime feel as unnatural as possible. Nature is a big theme of this film, and Villeneuve wanted to contrast the beautiful nature of Arrakis with the lifeless feel of Getty Prime. There was lots of talks about using different lenses on Getty Prime to give it such an unnatural look, and it worked well. The lack of color is a visual beauty on Getty Prime. Going back to Arrakis, Part 2 showed us the world of the Fremen for the first time. Their architecture had a lot of Arabic influences. There are many castles throughout the Middle East that are built into mountains and rocks. Fremen structures were built that way as well. Now, most of the shooting for these scenes in Arrakis took place in Jordan. All the wide shots and locations that heavily feature rock were filmed in Jordan. Fun fact, this is the same location where the desert scenes from The Rise of Skywalker were filmed. It may sound easy to just tell a crew to travel across the world and film in a desert, but in reality, these conditions are very hard on a cast and crew. It is not easy transporting a crew of 1,000 people across an open desert where there is no natural water to be found for miles on end. A fun fact I found out while researching the production of this movie was that the crew would zone off entire areas of the desert. They did this because they didn't want to film near sandy areas where there were footprints or tire tracks everywhere. That's a pretty neat detail to consider. When it came to the more open desert scenes, these were filmed in Abu Dhabi. Another fun fact, this is where the Jakku scenes were filmed from The Force Awakens. The vast openness of the desert is truly a marvel to look at. The crew talked about how beautiful the sunrises and sunsets were in Abu Dhabi, and you can tell they used a lot of those shots for the final film. They also mentioned how while they were filming, there was a partial solar eclipse, and they just decided to film it and use it in the final movie. That is a real solar eclipse. I bring this all up again to emphasize how important this aspect of the film was to Villeneuve. He went above and beyond in so many ways to make sure Arrakis and these other worlds felt like a real place, and that effort definitely pays off in the final product. Earlier I mentioned Villeneuve's two top priorities while making Dune, and that was the visual spectacle and honoring Frank Herbert's story as much as possible. Let's now talk about honoring the story. Villeneuve definitely made changes to the source material. There is no question about that. But unlike other adaptations we see these days where writers make changes because of egos or other silly reasons, Villeneuve only had Frank Herbert's vision in mind. Villeneuve famously said that Frank Herbert was frustrated by the reception of Dune because so many people saw Paul as a hero, when in reality he was supposed to be a tragic character, a warning to readers about the powerful influence of leaders. Villeneuve has said that most of the changes he made to this film are to really emphasize Frank Herbert's goal a lot more. Maybe the biggest change is Chani and her perspective on Paul and the war. This change not only gave more depth to Chani, but it really hammered home Paul's turn towards darkness. I will talk about the effectiveness of this change in a bit, but even if you don't like it, you should still appreciate Villeneuve's desire to better the story rather than making the change for some other selfish reason. It says a lot that so many of the cast and crew have nothing but good things to say about the production of this film. Warner Brothers doesn't have a perfect history of treating their casts and crew well, so it's relieving to hear how great of an environment Villeneuve created for this project. Principal photography began in July 2022 and concluded 5 months later in December of 2022. Over a year later, in March of 2024, Dune Part 2 was released in theaters. Going to see this film in IMAX was the talk of the month back then. While we can debate the quality of the movie itself, I think it's safe to say Dune Part 2 did so much for the movie-going experience. The production of Dune Part 2 says a lot about Denis Villeneuve and his approach to this film. Now we can talk about Villeneuve and his faithfulness to the source material, but at the end of the day, what really matters is the final product. So let's discuss the story of Dune Part 2. But before continuing on with the rest of this video, only 18.6% of viewers are subscribed to this channel. So if you're enjoying this video, please consider subscribing for more content like this. Thank you. There are two main aspects of Dune Part 2 that make it such a great film. The first is how the film works as a sequel, and the second is how everything works together to serve Paul Atreides' story. Let's discuss how the film works as a sequel first. The interesting thing about Dune Part 2 is that it's a bit of an unusual sequel. What do I mean by this? When you look at a sequel like The Empire Strikes Back or The Dark Knight, these are films that are true sequels. The first movie is told in a complete story, and now movie 2 is telling a new story that builds off the events of the previous movie. Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, maybe the most underrated sequel ever made, belongs in this conversation as well. Now, movies such as The Two Towers or The Desolation of Smaug are not natural sequels. The source material which those movies are based on aren't 3 novels, but one novel split into 3 movies. The Lord of the Rings books may have been marketed as 3 books, but in reality they are just one story split into into 3 volumes. Dune Part 2 belongs in that category because the source material of the first Dune book was split into 2 parts. So Dune Part 2 is not a sequel per se, it is the second half of the same story. When Dune Messiah comes out, aka Dune Part 3, that will technically be the sequel to Dune, even though it's the 3rd movie. Now, when you are splitting a movie into multiple parts the way Dune did, or some of these other movies have done, it's not as simple as having a 5-hour movie and just cutting it in half. Even though the Lord of the Rings book is really one book, the movies serve as 3 separate movies. Each one has a beginning, a middle, and an end. When Peter Jackson was adapting Lord of the Rings, he made some changes to the source material to make the movies feel like a natural story. If you look at the events of the book, the Two Towers movie ends a lot earlier in the wider story than the Two Towers book. Peter Jackson made this decision because finishing the story at Helm's Deep and finishing Frodo's story after escaping Gondor felt like a natural place to end the movie. So let's look at Dune. Dune Part 1 ended right after Paul killed Jamis. This was a solid place to split the story in 2, and here's why. Narratively, the story reaches its own mini climax right after the Harkonnens attack Arrakis. There's a big battle, many people die, and Paul and Jessica just manage to escape. The first movie could have ended here, and it probably would have worked. Paul meeting the Fremen for the first time and fighting Jamis is kind of like chapter 1 of the second half of the story. By moving this to the end of part 1 instead of the beginning of part 2, the scene now serves as a tease for the second movie. When Paul walks out onto the desert and Chani says this is only the beginning, it's a brilliant tease for what the second movie is going to be about. And that's Paul's relationship with the Fremen. So this decision made with part 1 gives part 2 momentum, and that's an important thing to have to begin a sequel. Now, outside of where one story ends and where the other begins, what makes Dune Part 2 a good sequel? Well, what does any good sequel do? It sets up a new conflict for our protagonist, it introduces new stakes, we meet new characters, we go to new locations, and the best sequels have a twist compared to the original. The way the Dune movies were structured was really smart. Considering so much of the conflict and so many of the characters were introduced in part 1, how can part 2 feel fresh and new? They did this by taking a lot of what happens in the first half of the book and waiting to introduce us to it in the second movie. There are multiple examples of this. Dune Part 1 doesn't touch on the Fremen too much. Obviously, there is some world building regarding the Fremen, and we also meet a few Fremen, including Stilgar, but it's not until the end of Part 1 where we really start to meet many of the Fremen. Most of the world building of the Fremen is not realized until the second movie. Part 2 is where we see the sieges of the Fremen, what they are like and how they live. Even though Chani is shown in vision after vision in Part 1, we don't actually learn about her character until Part 2. Even though the prophecies about the Lisan al-Gaib are mentioned in Part 1, they aren't really fleshed out until Part 2. By holding on to so much of the Fremen's story until Part 2, Part 2 feels like it has so much to offer rather than simply being a continuation of Part 1. Another example of this would be with Feyd-Rautha and Giedi Prime. I don't believe Feyd-Rautha was even mentioned in Part 1, so when we are introduced to him in Part 2, the whole sequence is captivating. Something new is being offered to the story. With the actual planet of Giedi Prime, sure, we see it in Part 1, but Part 2 is where we get the sequence where we see the lack of color on the planet and how visually striking it is. It kind of reminds me of Minas Tirith in Lord of the Rings. Sure, the city was shown in the Fellowship of the Ring, but it was so brief. It's not until Return of the King where we really are introduced to Minas Tirith. Introducing the Emperor and his daughter in Dune is another example. The Emperor was of course mentioned in Part 1, but actually meeting him, his daughter, and his homeworld in Part 2 is another thing that adds something fresh to this movie. The last thing that I'll mention is the ending of the movie. So when the movie ends, Paul's holy war begins. In the book, this doesn't happen right at the end of the book. Paul wins the battle, and then at the beginning of the second book do we learn about the holy war. By adding the start of the war to the end of this movie, aka the end of the first book, it lends more dramatic weight to Paul's decision to become the Lisan al-Gaib. The original ending could have worked, but this ending far better serves the themes that Villeneuve was going for, and it makes Part Part 2 a more entertaining film. This all may seem like a small point. In reality, it kind of is. Denis Villeneuve said he wanted this movie to stand on its own, to have people not necessarily need to watch Part 1 to enjoy Part 2. Now, while I think it's a little silly to have a movie called Dune Part 2 stand on its own, the movie mostly does. The opening sequence does a good job at summarizing the events of the first movie. So because so many new things are introduced in Part 2, it does largely stand on its own. Now, we can talk about all this new stuff the movie introduces, but the real reason Dune Part 2 is able to stand on its own is because of Paul's character arc. While Paul's arc of course begins in the previous movie, his struggle with his visions and his destiny doesn't really start until this movie. This way, the movie feels as close to a complete story as Part 2 can feel. Now let's talk about Paul's arc and how well it was crafted. Dune Part 2 establishes both its external and internal conflicts really well. The external conflict is of course the plot of the movie. The main objective here is to retake Arrakis, free the Fremen, and get revenge against the Emperor and the Harkonnens. The internal struggle is the more personal struggle that the main character goes through, and that's Paul struggling with realizing his visions or not. Every scene in this movie works to advance one of these two conflicts. Most stories forget to really hammer home the internal conflict. Dune Part 2 doesn't. Right from the first few scenes, this internal conflict is established. Jessica tells Paul they need to feed this idea of the prophecy to the Fremen. This way they can get their revenge against the Harkonnens. But Paul isn't too receptive to this initially, because he doesn't want to become a power-hungry tyrant. He kind of just wants to be a normal kid who helps people. As the movie progresses, Paul is tugged in one direction or the other. When Jessica becomes the Reverend Mother, that is supposedly part of the prophecy. More people start to believe that Paul is the Messiah because of his mother. More expectations are built. Now, the more Paul gets to know Chani, the more he learns about how much she doesn't believe in the prophecy. Paul is pulled against wanting to be the Messiah. After he accomplishes all these feats like winning a battle or riding a sandworm, more people, especially Stilgar, believe he is their Messiah. Even more expectations are built. Paul keeps having more and more dreams. In these dreams, he sees all the death and pain he will cause in the future. He is now pulled in the other direction. I want to add, I really like that with these visions Paul has, they are of a possible future rather than the future. I don't love the trope in movies where the future is set in stone and we see how the characters respond to that. I think it limits the story quite a bit and it takes away agency from our main characters. But by having Paul see visions of a future, it gives him more agency. Paul really has a choice in what his outcome will be. He doesn't have to become the Lisan al-Gaib if he doesn't want to. There's also added questions about if there are other futures that Paul hasn't seen where there could be peace. It makes the tragedy in the end feel that much stronger. Going back to the tension, when Paul is forced to go south, the thing he actively tried to avoid for most of the movie, he is now pulled in the direction of the Messiah again. By constantly tugging Paul back and forth between his desires and expectations, you are building more tension. Chani, Stilgar, his mother, the Fremen, his lust for revenge, it's all pulling on Paul in different directions. It's like when you have a rubber band. If you keep pulling and pulling the rubber band, the more tension there is in the rubber band and the closer it is to snapping. The essential question of Dune is, what will Paul's fate be? Will he choose to be with Chani and not be the Messiah? Or will he become the Messiah and start a holy war? So much tension is built surrounding this question, and it all pays off at the end of the movie when he finally chooses to be the Lisan al-Gaib. The tension is broken, and Paul has chosen the path of war. It deserves to be emphasized how important of a role Timothée Chalamet's acting plays in this. If Paul is going to become this power-hungry tyrant who starts a holy war that kills billions, you need to sell that transformation. In Dune Part 1, Paul is this timid and nervous kid. Even in Part 2, he kind of begins the movie this way. But by the end of the movie, he is giving these speeches to thousands of people, and he sounds like such a badass. That is character growth. Paul went from being silenced by the Reverend Mother to silencing her himself. One of my favorite little details at the end of the movie is when Paul stomps his foot demanding the Emperor to relinquish the throne. It was the demanding nature of that I can't picture Part 1 Paul doing, so I like that. When it comes to the external conflict, aka the battle between the Harkonnens and the Atreides, these scenes have so much build up as well. Pretty much the entire first movie was building up to this. The Atreides were betrayed and now Paul wants his revenge. With Part 2 specifically, they devoted an entire 20-minute sequence to introducing us to the guy that Paul would fight at the end of the movie. Showing us how crazy and fierce Feyd-Rautha is does make for an entertaining sequence, but the real narrative purpose behind it is making us question how Paul will hold up against this psychopath. It's like in The Empire Strikes Back, the reason they show Vader killing his own men over and over again is to build him up as a threat as much as possible, so we fear for Luke when he finally confronts him. When Gurney Halleck mentions that he knows where the Atreides family nukes are, that builds up tension for how they will be used in the third act. All this is great and makes for an excellent movie, but the main point of this video is to really hammer home how Denis Villeneuve and his philosophy made for such a great adaptation. I want to explore this by discussing maybe the biggest change from the book to the movie, and that's Chani's character. In the book, Chani is supportive of Paul through and through. In the movie, she is obviously very much against Paul becoming the Lisan al-Gaib. There are so many reasons why I think this was an excellent decision. The easiest answer is because it adds depth to Chani, a character that was quite one-dimensional in the book. Chani is arguably the second most important character in the movie, so giving her more depth is absolutely a must. Another thing this change does is it gives more depth to the Fremen as a whole. I appreciated that not every Fremen thinks the same way. In real-life religions, there are different denominations that believe in the same bigger picture but not in the smaller stuff. With the Fremen, I like how some of them believe in this prophecy and some of them don't. I don't entirely remember if this was a part of the book, it's been a while since I read it, but regardless, it was a welcome addition to the movie. Now, the most notable effect of Chani's change is how it affects Paul. As we've discussed, Paul's inner conflict is the heart of this film. Frank Herbert wanted this to be the heart of the book as well, but he was disappointed that some people didn't get that message. By having Chani framed this way, as someone who opposes the prophecy, when the movie ends, there is no question about how the audience is supposed to feel. The last shot of the movie is Chani crying. We know that we are not supposed to feel good about Paul going down this path. Villeneuve made a change that better served Frank Herbert's intentions. Chani's change in regards to Paul's struggle also puts a face on one side of his conflict. In the book, that struggle is still there, but there's no one pulling Paul in the opposite direction. Everyone wants him to become the Lisan al-Gaib, and it's only his visions that are warning him against that. In the movie, by having Chani be the one to oppose the prophecy, since we care about her, it gives us more of a reason for wanting Paul to choose Chani and reject the prophecy. It was also a wise decision to have Chani be really the only one to oppose the prophecy. Everyone from his mother to Stilgar to Gurney to most of the Fremen and his lust for revenge are pulling Paul towards accepting the prophecy. Chani and Paul's visions are the only thing preventing Paul from committing to it right away. It frames Chani as the underdog in the story. She's the angel on Paul's shoulder and everyone else is the devil. Even though she is the only one opposing the prophecy, she is given the same narrative weight as everyone else combined. So she feels like the underdog and therefore we want her to be happy, but in terms of the tension Paul feels, it's balanced between what he wants to do and what he feels he should do, aka it's balanced between Chani and every other character. This change does so much to benefit Paul in his story. I am stunned that some Dune fans dislike this change so much. One of the more recent videos I made was on Netflix's adaptation of Avatar: The Last Airbender. When covering the production of the show, I covered how the showrunner of the show made big changes to the characters because it supposedly felt dated. They needed to remove Sokka's sexism arc because it felt dated. They needed to remove any feminine qualities from Katara because of gender roles or whatever. This is an awful way to adapt the story. With Denis Villeneuve and Dune, if he said he wanted Chani to be a more active character because all the women in Dune were weak, and what Dune really needed was a strong female character, that would be ridiculous. That would show that Villeneuve was prioritizing his own ego and virtue signaling over Frank Herbert's vision. But he didn't do that. Villeneuve said, "I am making this change because I feel it better serves Frank Herbert's vision." That is how you adapt a beloved story. We can all agree adaptations should change some things. It's however the motivations behind those changes that really matter. Before we move on to the reception of the film, it's only fair that we briefly discuss how striking the visuals are. Denis Villeneuve shared a lot about his views on cinema during the production of this film. He repeatedly spoke about the importance of practical effects, the importance of real sets and filming on real locations, and this is without question felt in the movie. It's not just these locations, but the shots themselves. Villeneuve and cinematographer Greg Fraser really did all they could to make sure every frame of this movie could be a wallpaper on your computer. This is without question one of the most visually striking and beautiful movies ever made, especially for a blockbuster. Dune Part 2 excelled on so many levels. It was an excellently crafted sequel, especially since it was an unnatural natural sequel. The movie is an excellent adaptation of the book Dune. Villeneuve took Frank Herbert's themes and only expanded upon them in this film. And last but not least, the film is a visual marvel. Let's cover the reception of the film and see how it's held up 1 year later. Dune Part 2 scored a 92% on Rotten Tomatoes along with a 95% audience score. These numbers are both improvements compared to Part 1. On IMDb, the movie scored an 8.5 out of 10. This was a big improvement from Part 1. And on IMDb's best movies of all time list, they have Dune Part 2 listed as the 56th best movie ever made, 2 spots above my favorite movie ever, WALL-E. Dune Part 2 grossed $714 million at the box office, making it the 6th highest grossing movie of 2024. At the time of this video, we are approaching Oscar season. There's been reports that some Oscar voters refused to even watch Dune Part 2 because they didn't like Part 1. These people are getting slammed by the general public because Oscar voters aren't even seeing one of the best movies of the year. This says a lot about how well this movie has aged so far, and how much people love this movie. What do you think about Dune Part 2? Let me know down below. Tune in next week where we'll do another 1 year later retrospective, this time on the Halo series. I'm sure that'll be fun. Thank you everyone so much for watching another one of my videos. Don't forget to tonight the Claude Squad, and I'll see you guys next time.